try. Thank you.
It works.
Well, thank you and welcome tonight. I'm Mark Peterson from the Department of Government at Harvard, and I am serving tonight as the moderator for this event. It's a great pleasure to have you all here. It's a marvelous opportunity for us to have a conversation about the campaign that is a somewhat broader and wider perspective than what we've been used to over the last couple of weeks. We don't have to worry anymore about stories about the president calling his opponents bozos and the challenger, Clinton, losing his voice as he tried to speak on and on and on in states throughout the country. What we try to do tonight is to bring some historical perspective to how we ought to think about this particular presidency that we're about to embark upon. What I'd like to do before introducing our very distinguished panel of presidential observers, historians, and scholars is to raise possible agenda items that we might think about. We're going to be free to talk about all kinds of things. I think it's going to be a marvelous discussion. We just had a bit of one over dinner. We're certainly going to talk about, I think, the opportunity that presidents have to think about history and use history for their own purposes. But I also think we might want to reflect on a few historical parallels or possible parallels. What should we be thinking about in terms of Bill Clinton taking the presidency? For instance, one issue is whether or not or how we ought to think about the issue of generational change with Bill Clinton being elected. Bill Clinton will be the third youngest president of the United States. The only time there was a wider gap in the age between the candidates was when John Kennedy ran against, excuse me, not between the candidates, between the incumbent and the next administration. It was between Kennedy and Eisenhower in 1960, which was a somewhat wider gap in between Bush and Clinton going into this race. And it raises issues. We recall the rhetoric of 1960. You remember the inaugural address. John Kennedy talked about the torch having been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace. If you think about what Bill Clinton would have to face, it's a very different world. Time magazine's correspondent Walter Shapiro, for instance, suggested that if Bill Clinton were to talk about, in truth, in fact, the generational change that he's dealing with, he'd have to have a somewhat different speech. The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans, born after World War II, nurtured in prosperity, aroused by Vietnam, sustained by rock and roll, tested by drugs and promiscuity, embraced by the media, and belatedly betrayed by the nation's decline in living standards. Hardly the same kind of clarion call that we had from John Kennedy. And the question is, do we face the opportunity for this president and this generation to have the same kind of leadership or not? A second possible historical parallel is the one that many Republicans are already trying to sell the public on, and that is that with the Clinton administration, what we really have is a new movie that we might call Jimmy Carter, the sequel. In this case, in both cases, we have Southern governors with no previous national or international experience coming into office and working with a Congress that is controlled by their own party, but a party that is very heterogeneous. Does this mean that Clinton is going to have the troubles that a Jimmy Carter had? Or instead, should we think about another parallel? And that is perhaps Clinton's temperament and the kind of politician he is matters. Perhaps what we ought to look back to is a little bit further back in history, when another Democratic governor who truly loved and reveled in politics won an election during a period of hard economic times. Perhaps the governor that we should be looking at had not the initials JC, but the initials FDR. It's another possible parallel. Or take something that Senator Bob Dole has raised recently. Perhaps the Clinton experience is going to be a difficult one because Clinton is a plurality president. He's a president who won 43.2% of the popular vote. That's even less than Nixon received in 1968, 43.4% of the vote. And there are some who suggest, like Stephen Stark from the Boston Globe, that any time you have a presidential winner who wins less than 45% of the vote, there's bound to be trouble and difficult times for the country. Is that the situation we're going to face? Or should we look at another way, look at the Clinton victory in another way? And that is every time in this century that a challenger has defeated an incumbent president and turned that president into a one-term president, Woodrow Wilson in 1912, FDR in 1932, Ronald Reagan in 1980, We had presidents who had very bold domestic programs and who in very important and lasting ways reshaped the American presidency. Is that the opportunity that we face today with Bill Clinton? So I'd like to introduce the panel, perhaps have them talk about those issues and any other issues that they may wish to discuss. But first, let me give you a sense of really quite how distinguished a panel we have up here. First, it's a delight for me to welcome Doris Kearns Goodwin here, someone whom I think a lot of you already know. She's a very highly respected member of the IOP community here. While working on her PhD at Harvard University some time ago, she won a White House fellowship that brought her to Washington to work in the Johnson administration, and she worked directly with Lyndon Johnson in the White House. And based on that experience and her subsequent associations with Johnson, produced her book, Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream, which was a penetrating national bestseller about the Johnson administration and Johnson's public and private life, both before and during his administration. Her subsequent award-winning book, The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, probes the life of Kennedy's family before his inauguration, and that book spent half a year on the New York Times bestseller list. She's been a member of our faculty at Harvard, and she's become a particularly familiar face for many of us, I think, over the last several months, as we've seen her as one of the more astute political commentators on Boston television. Second, it's quite an honor to have David McCulloch here with us tonight. He's the author of innumerable essays in a variety of magazines and journals, as well as several best-selling and award-winning books, including Mornings on Horseback, his book examining the early life of Theodore Roosevelt. For many of us, he has become, in a way, the voice of American history. He's hosted the American Experience, a series on PBS, and served as a narrator of the documentary LBJ, and a narrator of that incredible production by PBS, The Civil War. After a decade of careful research, this summer he published the remarkable, well-reviewed biography of Harry Truman, now in its 20th week on the New York Times bestseller list. Many people I've talked to in the past have sort of wondered whether you could write a book of such length about a president who's been out of office for 4 decades and capture a public attention, but certainly it's a testament to both President Truman and to the skills and engaging writing of David McCulloch that such a volume has become a book capturing the popular imagination. Finally, it's always a privilege to share company with Richard Neustadt, the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government Emeritus here at the Kennedy School. Introducing Dick Neustadt to an audience at the Kennedy School is somewhat akin to introducing Madonna to a room full of MTV fans. I think we all know Dick very well. He's been on the faculty here since 1965. He retired in 1989, but continues to teach in the programs here and is an active participant all the time in the affairs of the Institute of Politics. Dick Neustadt began his presidentialist career working directly in the White House with President Truman and has advised presidents ever since. His book, Presidential Power, first published in 1960 with a recent new edition in 1990, remains the most widely assigned book in any course on American politics in America, and is also an invaluable guide and always read by anyone thinking about the presidency, being elected to the presidency, and their staffs. His award-winning volume, Thinking in Time, that he co-authored with Ernest May, helps us understand how to use history intelligently in order to make better judgments about the present. And with that, I think we ought to turn to our task for tonight, which is to think about history intelligently and how it might help us have some perspective on this administration and this election. We're going to start first with Dick Neustadt and then move on to Doris Kearns and then David McCulloch, and they will each speak for a short period of time, and we'll have some exchange, and then we'll open it up to the audience here. We've got 2 microphones on the first floor, and we'll just try to have a nice conversation about how we might use history to understand our current circumstances. Dick.
After that introduction, I suppose I should ignore your opening remarks altogether, but I will not. I will let me take a crack at a couple of the historical questions you threw out, the analogies you talked about, and then my colleagues can improve upon them and depart from them and go on to other things which they find more interesting, if there are any. First, on this generational matter, there's no doubt in my mind that this election does do what the '60 election did for the generation of the junior officers in World War II. Only this does it for the baby boomers And it seems to work just as it did then, not only for the generation, but for the next one that follows it down. I've been teaching an undergraduate course at Cornell, and there's great excitement among 20-year-olds about Clinton, just as there was at the time about Kennedy. So it's more than generational. It's a sense of the old crocs are gone. I suppose that can happen at any time, but I think it's happened at both these times. It's aided by the sense that the Eisenhower administration emanated, perhaps not quite realistically, but did emanate, of being tired, out of steam. And certainly Mr. Bush contributed everything he could to that effect, all winter, spring, and summer. In some curious way, I think he was out of steam. He regained his steam at the very end. But it was a curious period, whether it was psychological or medical or what, I don't know. But he was tired. He managed to make people feel that he was tired. And now the great difference is that the baby boom generation is not like the generation of World War II. It's bigger. Every institution it has touched has crumbled under its onslaught. I mean, the grammar schools were overwhelmed, the high schools were overwhelmed, the colleges went up in a certain amount of smoke, and so forth. So that I wouldn't assume that representing and invigorating the baby boom generation is going to produce the same effect as invigorating the junior officers of World War II, which was a much more conventional undertaking in many ways.
May I add a wrinkle to that?
Yeah.
A wrinkle to the question of generational change, and that is not only is it Bill Clinton, but it's also Hillary Clinton and Al and Tipper Gore are all of the same generation, bringing with them not only the representation of the generation, but all that is involved, for instance, in the women's movement and the role of having a ticket that represents altogether that generation rather than the generational split between Johnson and Kennedy in 1960.
I'm sure that's right. It emphasizes it. It emphasizes a lot of issues. I've been getting questions which suggest to me that Hillary Clinton's problem is going to be different from that of all previous first ladies, not only because she has been much more of a partner in her husband's decision-making than other first ladies, but because a lot of professional women in this country want her to stand forward as a professional woman, something that'll be damned hard for her to do and be effectively a partner in the White House. It's a lot of issues that were not on the scene before are built into this generational thing. I buy that. As for the problem of being a minority president, a la Woodrow Wilson, I think there's a fundamental difference. Wilson got in only because the Republican Party split that year. In this case, as I understand the election, Mr. Bush lost it. The split is between two oppositions to the incumbent. And if the Perot vote was apparently itself closely split among Republicans and Democrats. So the task facing Mr. Clinton is not to build a majority drawn away from the other party, as Mr. Reagan built Reagan Democrats. His problem is merely to recapture the Democrats who voted for Perot while holding on to the rest of them. I regard that as probably speaking, an easier task in politics, although I don't want to make any predictions. And maybe with this I should shut up and let my colleagues get on with it.
Thank you. Doris?
Well, I thought I'd like to bring up some other historical parallels. Really, some of the traits that I saw evidenced in this campaign and how they have resonance for me when I think about the past. The first that we were talking over dinner seemed to be the physical energy that Clinton showed in his campaign, almost a voracious hunger to touch that last outstretched hand. You'd watch him on that bus tour at night until 2 a.m., waiting until the last questioner had asked his question. And it reminded me so of those scenes in 1964 when Lyndon Johnson would lean so far over the wire fence that his body was catapulted up in the air because he couldn't get enough of that energy that came from the crowd. I mean, he told me he'd be absolutely exhausted late at night, but all he needed was a surging crowd and his depleted energy would come back to the fore again. He said that he loved the idea that he somehow knew how to shake one person's hand while putting his arm around another and looking the third one in the eye. Somehow he could do all that at one time. And I think there's no question that during the campaign, Clinton's energy proved a positive force. He really outlasted his rivals because he had more energy than they did. Bob Kerrey, because of his confusion about why he was running, seemed to lack energy, and it showed when we looked at him. Tom Harkin took a 3-week vacation after he announced for the presidency, and he was sort of gone. And I think Tsongas's problems with cancer in the past meant that he had a more genteel schedule so that he couldn't compete on the energy level despite his swimming commercials that we saw over and over again. And somehow it seemed that Clinton wanted it more, that he needed it more. Not always the most attractive quality, but in a time when the Democrats were hungering to get back in public office, the person who hungered the most, I think, had a certain value for us. The interesting thing is that not all politicians have that kind of voracious love of touching people. Nixon is one of those people who I remember Steve Hess saying that when somebody touched him on the back, he would recoil, almost as if he didn't want to be touched in that way. And that voracious energy can be a handicap if the politician becomes too consumed by it. I've talked before, I've always thought when I watched Lyndon Johnson at the end of his life that one of the saddest things was that because politics was the only thing that mattered, there was nothing that could console him in his retirement at the end of his life. I mean, everything on that ranch was dedicated to being a mock symbol of what it had once been like when he was in power. He couldn't get through the days without having meetings with his field hands in the mornings, but they'd be telling him how many cows were going to be milked that day or how many people were going to go through the Lyndon Johnson birthhouse rather than what executive orders he was going to sign. And his pool was so filled with objects of work that he couldn't even swim in it. It had floating desks with floating pads and floating lunch trays that came by on floating things so he could work in the middle of the pool. He was always a little overweight, so you'd see this huge whale-like figure swimming in between these various desks that sat in the middle of the pool. But the incredible thing was that he used to tell me that during his campaigns, he got such pleasure out of politics that he could shake 1,000 hands and never get a blister. Out of office, he shook 7 hands, and he'd come back with his hands totally filled with blisters, showing that there's some magic that attacks itself when a politician and the crowd are surging together. And I think Clinton had that. The interesting thing that FDR had, who I'm currently working on, was an extraordinary capacity to relax along with that voracious hunger and love of politics. In the middle of the worst decisions, he could stay in his study and play with his stamps. He could talk about movies. He had a cocktail hour at night where he refused to talk about politics. Eleanor would come in and want to talk about civil rights, or when she picked the movie, she'd pick documentaries, and he'd get so pissed off because he really wanted to see some real movie. And he loved flirting with women. He could always go back to Hyde Park and find solace from Hyde Park. And one of the real questions is, will Clinton be able to find solace and rest and serenity and relaxation along with that hunger? Lyndon Johnson never could, and it's an open question whether Clinton can. I think a second quality that has a counterpart in history is the persistence that Clinton showed in the campaign, that willingness to take the punches and come back. From my analysis at Channel 5 up here, I remember the day that the Gennifer Flowers press conference took place. We were absolutely convinced that was the end of his presidency, his campaign. We heard he was in a motel room crying, holed up, and about ready to resign. And certainly when you think about the frenzy that accompanied that moment, it seemed likely that he might have to do that. Think back to 1988 when Joe Biden, in a similar kind of frenzy, did pull out within 3 days of the first announcement that he had presumably plagiarized a speech from Neil Kinnock, the labor leader, and then from Robert Kennedy without attribution. It was interesting because William Safire, I remember at the time, wrote a column and he said, look, all speechwriters plagiarize. The best ones take from the past. And he said that his favorite speech that he wrote for Nixon deliberately borrowed from one that Sam Rosenman had written for Roosevelt. And Rosenman evidently wrote him back and said, do you want to know something? I got mine from Ralph Ingersoll in 1876. And had Biden had the courage to live out that frenzy, it's conceivable that he could have still remained a candidate. But the frenzy got to him and he resigned from the race. Clinton would have been totally destroyed if he had left at that point. And in a certain sense, he was at such a bottom, because if you leave over Jennifer Flowers, it's a lot worse, I think, than leaving over plagiarism. But nevertheless, he went on television, 60 Minutes, as you all recall, at that Super Bowl. And I think what was so extraordinary in retrospect historically about that night when Hillary sat next to him, in contrast to Gary Hart, who also went before a press conference and had his wife Lee Hart by his side and said, if she can forgive me, why can't you, the people, forgive me? But one look at Lee Hart's face, which was so pained, made it clear that she had been humiliated by this man. And I think every woman in the country felt, I'm going to kill this guy for doing it to this woman. In contrast, when Hillary Clinton sat by her husband, it was clear that she wanted to be there, that she had every bit as much energy and ambition in this joint quest for the presidency. No one had to feel sorry for her. And I think subconsciously that moment, as stiff as that interview was and as in some ways as awkward as it seemed, it worked to break the spell of the potential notion that Hillary was a victim and allowed him to go forward. I think a third quality that has some parallels in history is the capacity that was lambasted during the campaign, but is a real political capacity to speak to different groups and make them all feel like you're speaking to them. I mean, Clinton deliberately emphasized tax credits and investments for business, jobs for middle America, reformed health care for everyone, capital punishment for the conservatives, racial harmony for blacks. Part of what Lyndon Johnson offered in 1964 was something for everything, for the handicapped, for the ill, for the lame, for the poor, for the rich, that's what he said. And his proudest moment, he said, was that when people who were conservative would come up to him and said, I like you because you're a conservative. People who were liberal would say, I like you because you're a liberal. And people who were moderate would say, I like you because you're a moderate. He had this huge grin on his face. I knew I'd win then. They all loved me. But part of that is not only a political skill to reach out to other people, it's a temperamental need to have everybody like you. And that can be a weakness as well as a strength. I mean, it's true about FDR as well. He would agree with every single person that came into his office with disparate ideas they would present him with. They'd all go out happy thinking, he's going to do what I say. And then, of course, he would do what he wanted to do afterwards. But he never had the courage to confront people directly. He could never fire anybody. I've heard Bill Clinton has that same capacity or incapacity. But in FDR's case, depression and war necessitated his having to take stands and make enemies early on. And I think a president has to do that and has to learn that it's more important to be loved by the people that you love than to be loved by 90% of the population. Roosevelt's crises forced that upon him, and I think it made him a much better president. And again, I would hope for Clinton's sake that at some point he knows that it doesn't matter if you're loved by the majority. You just have to have at least enough people that support what you're doing. The other problem with that capacity for giving everybody what they want and saying whatever they want you to hear is after a while it means that you blur fact and fiction. Johnson's case was epidemic with that. After a while, I don't think he knew what was true about even his own past. I mean, the story that I can never get out of my head is one day when I was swimming with him in that great obstacle-laden pool, and Hugh Sidey had just written a book. It was when he was still president, talking about a speech that Johnson had given to the troops going to Vietnam. And in the speech, Johnson talked about his great-great-grandfather dying at the Battle of the Alamo. Sidey said it was a wonderful speech, except that he didn't have a great-great-grandfather at the Alamo. He just wished he did so much that he had made him up. And so I said to him, how can you do that? How can you just make this man up? And he says to me as he's splashing around, oh, these journalists are such sticklers for detail. And then he described how his great-great-grandfather had really died at the Battle of San Jacinto, and for a wonderful half hour I heard why that was more important in the history of Texas than the Alamo. He was so persuasive that I was convinced that Sidey was being a stickler for detail until years later I did my biography and discovered he hadn't died there either. That he had died at home in bed, sadly. So I hope for Clinton's sake that somehow he'll be able to know what he truly believes in and what he's saying to make other people want to believe that he believes in. But I suppose the last thing I'd like to say as an historian, that I think one of the great benefits of Clinton pulling out a win in this race, despite the early frenzy over who he slept with, when, and how, is that the people at large seem to give more tolerance and more generosity to the private life of our public figure in this case than the press was willing to grant at the time. I had a fear early in this campaign, which was exacerbated from the '88 campaign, that we were moving into a situation where we were going to demand our presidents to be so stoic, so interesting, so boring, that we'd be left with the Richard Nixons, whose main sexual activity was talking on the phone in his striped pajamas to Bebe Rebozo at night, or maybe Jimmy Carter lusting after people that he never quite could get because he was just lusting after them.
Only in his heart.
Only in his heart. And perhaps one of the things that this campaign has done is to restore some measure of legitimacy to private lives of our figures, so that if we demand that privacy gone from them, they lose their mystery, they lose their essence, they lose who they are. Lincoln once said, "Show me a man without vices, and I'll show you a man without virtues." And I've often thought biography that we all do, historians, is so much more complex than the everyday reporting makes it seem sometimes. I think of how the press would have reported FDR's situation in the White House in today's terms, how they would have delighted in the fact of finding out that he had had an affair with a young woman named Lucy Mercer when he had been married for 12 years and was the father of 4 children. The fascination they would have attached to his relationship with his secretary, Missy LeHand, who was really his other wife, taking care of him while Eleanor traveled, loving him all of her life, never marrying, anticipating his needs, setting up a poker game when he was grouchy during the day, being his hostess at cocktail hours. There was a curiosity about that that would have known no bounds, I think. Or what curiosity there would have been among the press about this formidable mother of this man who never let him go, to the point where when he went to Harvard, she took a house in Boston. When he got married, she bought adjoining townhouses, one for Eleanor and him, one for herself, that had a door that went in between. And how interested they would have been in the fact that Eleanor and he presumably were not sleeping together, but that Eleanor was his partner in a very unconventional way, his eyes and his ears, traveling around the country, doing more good for him than she possibly could have done had she been a conventional wife. And how much fascination they would have had with her female friends, how the press would have enjoyed the speculation about those close relationships, obsessing over whether there was a lesbian relationship to them, when the really interesting question is, what role did these women play in this extraordinary woman's life? Looking from the outside in other words, we might have labeled Roosevelt an adulterer. We could have accused him of harassment of a secretary, could have argued that Eleanor was a lesbian, and I think it would totally miss the mark of trying to understand the complex bonds between a fascinating group of people who were all trying to give as much love and life and work and respect and affection to one another and get through to do what they wanted to do for the country. Indeed, when the mother Sarah died and Missy suffered a stroke in 1941, it so disrupted this unconventional pattern that Roosevelt had created for himself. Franklin was so lonely that he asked Eleanor essentially to be his wife again, to stop traveling, to be his companion. He so needed her, and yet she'd been so hurt so long before that she couldn't really give in to his need. She was so addicted to work and travel that she started traveling again, to the point where he was so lonely that he brought their daughter Anna in to take care of him. Delighting Eleanor at first, this was her favorite child, the only one she'd confided in about the affair with Lucy. But then Anna got to the White House and she became her father's daughter, once again leaving Eleanor out. And then in the last year of his life, when he had congestive heart failure, he met up with Lucy Mercer again, essentially for the first time in a long, long time. And I think he felt that need to just be young again, before polio, before his heart failure. And he wanted to see her regularly. The only way he could do that was to ask Anna, his daughter, to intercede when Eleanor was away to arrange for Lucy's regular visits. You can imagine the dilemma it put this daughter in, but she loved her father and her mother, and she decided to do it. Lucy visited regularly that last year, always when Eleanor was away, and somehow Anna and Lucy became friends. From the outside in, who could ever understand this? And yet somehow none of these people meant to hurt each other. Indeed, while Lucy was there, Eleanor was out celebrating triumphs, desegregation orders in the PXs in the army camps, women with daycare in the factories, doing what she wanted to do. And finally, of course, sadly, Eleanor would never have had to know about it, but for the fact that he was at Warm Springs and so was Lucy when FDR died. And when Eleanor came that night, a spinster cousin was there who was always jealous of Eleanor, in my judgment. And when Eleanor asked her to tell her everything that happened, she told her that Lucy had been there, and not only that, but had been in the White House. Not only that, had become friendly with the daughter, Anna. I can't even imagine what Eleanor absorbed at that moment of absorbing her husband's death. She went back to the White House. All she could do was yell at Anna and say, "How could you have done this? How could you have betrayed me?" And Anna said, "I didn't know what to do. I was caught in a crossfire." But then an incredible capacity that human beings have that we reporters and historians never give them enough credit for. That summer, Eleanor traveled around the country again, as she always had. And everyone kept coming up to her and telling her how much they loved FDR. And she saw that the country had become the country she wanted it to be. She so wanted a social revolution to take place during World War II. Suddenly, blacks and whites had worked together in the factory. Suddenly, veterans were going to school and GI Bill that had never been to college before. And she began to feel that without him, without his political sense of timing, all of her agitation, she was always further to the left, would never have been realized. And in her heart, she began slowly to forgive him. And as the war came to an end, she went to Anna and forgave her daughter as well, affording a reconciliation between them that lasted for the rest of their lives. And as I think about that complex, rich relationships of all these people, we would get it so wrong if we didn't understand that they were making their own way. And my greatest hope for this campaign is that perhaps we've provided a window for a private life that we won't be intruding and misinterpreting and give leeway to people to live that rich private life, because without a rich private life, they'll be boring, uninteresting public figures as well. Enough said.
Thank you.
Well, as a great many of you have undoubtedly noticed, we had a number of people running around the country recently saying they were Harry Truman. And so I feel somewhat obligated to stress that I'm talking about the real Harry Truman and to tell you a little bit about how this came about, why it happened. If only to say something for the record. About 3 or 4 years ago, President Bush and Mrs. Bush established a series of White House lectures about past presidents and their lives in the White House. And Professor David Donald from Harvard was invited to give the first lecture on Abraham Lincoln. And these lectures are delivered in the East Room, and there are about 250 people are invited. And the stress is mostly on the life of that president in the White House, he and his family. And then there's a reception afterward, and it's a very nice occasion. And Professor Remini from Illinois did Andrew Jackson, and there was a lecture on George Washington. And I was called about 3 years ago to lecture on Theodore Roosevelt. And I had been working on my Truman biography by then, about 5 or 6 years, and I said to the woman from the National Endowment for the Humanities who called that I was very pleased to be invited, and of course I would accept, but I wanted her to understand that my real interest for some time had been Harry Truman, and that I hoped very much that if I accepted, by accepting the invitation to speak on Theodore Roosevelt, that it wouldn't mean when the time came to have someone talk about Harry Truman that they would pick somebody else. And she said, "Oh, Mr. McCullough, I think it will be a very, very long time before President Bush wants to hear anything about Harry Truman." Well, if this was an old movie, you'd see the headlines flipping by and time passing, and it's now the summer of early July of 1992, and again the same call comes through. Mr. Bush would love it if you would come down and give a lecture in the same place, under the same kind of format on Harry Truman. Well, I didn't quite know what to do about that. First of all, I'm a Democrat, and I thought, do I want to go down? And I thought, no, the President of the United States is inviting you to do this. And so I called a few friends whose advice I respect, and they said, of course you should do it. He needs all the education he can get. So we went, and President Bush and Mrs. Bush were just as cordial and generous as host and hostess as always, and it was a very fine occasion with a number of people from the cabinet and from the Congress in the audience. And when Mr. Bush introduced me, he said that he had 2 copies of my book, my new book. One was upstairs in the family quarters, and the other was up at Camp David. And he said, I must confess, I started to read it from the beginning, but after about 30 pages, I decided to skip ahead to the 1948 campaign. And I read that entire chapter, he said, and I liked it because it had a happy ending. And it was not very long after that that he began talking about Harry Truman. And I was called by the Today Show and the New York Times and the usual